Hello again. In this talk, we're preparing for material that we'll consider more in the second month of the course under the heading, Who is God and what are God's purposes? And in the question of who is God, we're going to look today briefly at some introductory ideas about the doctrine of the Trinity. Just need to say there is a handout that goes with this, which will also be on Moodle. The picture, some of you will know what it is. It's an icon, and it's called the Rublev icon, and it was created back in the 14th or 15th century. It's an icon of the Trinity, and on the left-hand side, looking at the other two characters, is the Father. In the center is Jesus, and on the right-hand side is the Spirit. You might just want to look at that for a little bit, and we'll say more about that as we look at the Trinity in more detail later. So let's begin. And I wanted to do the question of this question: which is easier, trying to explain the Trinity or trying to describe your experience of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? And to help us think about this, I'm going to have a little extract from the work of Adrian Plass. If you haven't read any of the Adrian Plass's Sacred Diary, do get hold of it, because it's very funny and very wise. And this is about one of the characters in the Sacred Diary, called Leonard Thynne, who's volunteered to explain the Trinity at the church that he and Adrian go to. So he starts by getting an old electric fire out and plugs it in to a socket at the side of the church and faces the congregation. And he begins like this: Right, Trinity, easily explained. When I switch on the mains in a moment, I want all of you, but especially the children, to watch very, very closely and see if you can spot what happens. Ready, here we go. Keep those eyes skinned or you might miss it. Suddenly felt glad I was sitting at the back. When Thynne pushed the switch down, there was a loud bang and a shower of sparks. Leonard screamed and stumbled back into Doreen Cook's lap. Several children put their hands up. Little Dottie Rawlings called out, I saw, it blowed up and frightened you. Is that what the Trinity means, Mr. Thynne? Leonard got up and faced us again, looked rather white, and his hair was sticking up on end. He said, Sorry about that, everybody. Little light should have come on, and I was going to say that was like Jesus. And then I was going to say that the electricity was like the Holy Spirit. And then, well, oh, never mind. Hang on. And then he goes on to get another electrical implement out as an explanation of the Trinity, and that doesn't work either. And the next evening, Leonard comes round along with the Plass's very wise neighbour called Frank, and they ask Frank how he would explain the Trinity. He lit his pipe and said, You know, there are 4 things I like about the Trinity. First, I love having a Father in God. Second, I love having a friend and brother in Jesus. Third, I love having a comforter and guide in the Holy Spirit. And fourth, Anne and I said yes, fourth, I love the fact that it's a mystery. God in 3 persons. 3 persons, one God. It's a mystery, and I love it. Why would I want to spoil things by trying to explain it? Muttered Leonard, who wasn't listening. Maybe if I'd used an automatic toaster. Is it easier trying to explain the Trinity or trying to describe your experience of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Some preliminary points as we start thinking about the Trinity. The first is we're dealing with mystery. One of my favourite quotes of St. Augustine is this: If you can understand it, it's not God. If you can understand it, it's not God. The second point is that the Trinity actually comes from the Church's experience of God. A writer called Paul Fides says this: When the early church fathers developed the doctrine of the Trinity, they were not painting by numbers. They were finding concepts to express an experience. And we'll see more of that in a moment. Thirdly, the Trinitarian doctrine is not an optional extra to be added on at the end. but it's the fundamental character of the God who saves us. Alistair McGrath writes this: the Trinity implies a God who is outside space and time and cannot be involved. If you don't have a view of the Trinity, if you have a simple view of God as out there somewhere, that view implies a God who is outside space and time and cannot become involved with it. It implies a God whom we have to discover rather than a God who makes himself known. It implies a God who is always beyond us and not a God who comes to meet us where we are. The Christian church was faced with a choice. It either adopted a God who could be understood but could not redeem, or a God who could redeem and yet not be understood. Rightly, as events proved, it adopted the second of these two options, a God who could redeem but was more difficult to understand than a simple view of God. And then the fourth point is this, which is one I'm sure we'll all be thankful for. Our relationship to God does not depend upon the depth or correctness of our understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity. If it did, then who could be saved? So let's move on to the foundations of the doctrine of the Trinity in the New Testament. And this begins with the experience of the first followers. And this comes from Mike Lloyd's Cafe Theology, and the extract concerned is available on Moodle for further details. First of all, it says in Jesus, they realized that God was visiting his people. But they also realized from their experience that Jesus was distinct from the Father. Then after Pentecost, they began to experience a presence within themselves which they recognized to be divine. But they also knew that the Spirit was not the same as Jesus or the Father. And that's the experience that the doctrine of the Trinity begins with. It begins with that experience of the first disciples of Jesus and the Father and the Spirit. That's what they had to wrestle with. In terms of the Spirit in the New Testament, there's actually a lot less in the New Testament about the Spirit than there is about Jesus. Tom Wright points out that this is not surprising, since the Spirit is what you look through rather than what you look at. But he discusses how, in various passages, Paul sees the church and Christians as, in some sense, the temple of the Holy Spirit. Passages in 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, in Ephesians, details on the notes. And Wright argues that Yahweh had promised to return to his temple, and that the temple in the New Testament is the church, is the people of God. So Christians as temple of the Holy Spirit, and Yahweh is present amongst them, is present amongst us by his Spirit. This is how Yahweh makes himself present to us, through his Spirit. Then also in the New Testament, you have small things about Trinitarian relationships. There's very little discussion of the Trinity. The name isn't mentioned, but throughout we see in the New Testament that Jesus is who he is and does what he does within his relationship to his Father and in the relationship to the Spirit. Famously at the beginning, the baptism of Jesus, Jesus sees the Spirit descending like a dove. And then Jesus hears the voice of his Father saying, "You are my beloved Son." Right at the beginning of his ministry, Father, Son, and Spirit are involved together. And then at the Last Supper, particularly in John 14, we see Father, Son, and Spirit all being promised to be with us. Jesus says in verse 23 of John 14, "If anyone loves me, he will obey my teaching. My Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him." And throughout the Last Supper talks, he talks about the Father sending the Holy Spirit to be with them. But then also within the New Testament, there's this idea of there being unity and diversity within God. Jesus says, I and the Father are one. But he also says, the Father is greater than I. There is unity between Father, Son, and Spirit, but there is also difference. Unity and diversity. So the issues for the early church, as they wrestled with their experience and what it meant, people who were monotheistic, they believed in one God, what did they have to resolve in all of this? Firstly, if Christ is God, how is he related to God? Remember, by the way, that in the New Testament, the word God usually refers to God the Father. And then if Christ and the Spirit were also divine, does that mean one God or three gods? And clearly they needed to avoid the idea of three gods because they were Jewish monotheists. They believed in one God very strongly. Another false road that they had to avoid was that of saying, well, Father, Son, and Spirit are just different experiences or activities of the one God. It's a heresy that later became to be called modalism, and it was something they had to avoid. And then the question of how do Father, Son, and Spirit relate to each other? Those were issues they had to wrestle with. And they had some guiding ideas as to how they could resolve this. First of all, as we've seen in the discussion of who Jesus is, to bring about salvation, Jesus had to be both human and divine. And you've seen that in the discussion of the councils and the formulation of their understanding of the person of Christ in the creeds. The other thing that was a guiding idea was that they had to hold in tension the unity of God and diversity in God. Let me move on. So the early developments in the 2nd and 3rd century, we'll just do those, and then we'll leave it for this session. Irenaeus, that's a picture of Irenaeus. Irenaeus was at the end of the 2nd century. He was the Bishop of Lyon, and what he did, two key points he made. First of all, the importance of incarnation for salvation, the importance of God becoming man for our salvation. And secondly, he talked about the different roles of Father, Son, and Spirit in what's known as the economy of salvation, how salvation works. Father, Son, and Spirit did different things in the economy of salvation. And then the second figure is somebody who came from Carthage, which you'll see on the bottom left there in present-day Tunisia. And Carthage was the home of a man called Tertullian. And Tertullian was a key figure in the early development of the doctrine of the Trinity. He invented the language of the Trinity, although it's important to realize that being from Africa rather than the Eastern Mediterranean, he spoke Latin rather than Greek. And one of the constant problems for the church was that at one end of the empire you had Latin speakers, at the other end of the empire you had Greek speakers, and they didn't always understand the subtleties of each other's language. But the language of the Trinity that Tertullian invented is still used today. First of all, there was substance. And substance is what the three persons of the Trinity have in common and expresses their fundamental unity. It's not the stuff of which they're made. The Eastern theologians talk about it much more as the essence or being. Substance describes what God is. It's the godness of God, if you like. But then the persons are what distinguishes Father from Son from Spirit. And we'll look at this a lot more next time. Tertullian actually took the word person from theatrical usage. It was the mask that you held in front of you to represent the fact that you were playing a different character. And for Tertullian, substance was what unites the three aspects of God, and persons was what distinguishes them. Substance unites, persons distinguish. So what I'd like you to do before our next session, before next month's session, is to think something very important, actually. because when we think about the Trinity and thinking about God as three persons, we need to know, what do we mean by the word person? So I'd like you to think over these next couple of weeks, what is a person? What's your understanding of person? Thank you.